interests include the Supreme Court, federalism, executive power, and constitutional interpretation. Cohen is the author of two books, Rationing the Constitution and Prosecuting the President. The former explains how judicial capacity shapes Supreme Court decision-making. The latter explains how special prosecutors hold presidents accountable and protect the rule of law, and was a finalist for the Ava Silver Gable Award. Cohen's work has also appeared in Yale Law Journal, Stanford Law Review, Virginia Law Review, and University of Pennsylvania Law Review, among others. He frequently appears in the national media and has contributed articles to The Atlantic, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, CNN.com, San Francisco Chronicle, and USA Today. So welcome, Andrew Cohen. Thank you for accepting to be with us today.
Thank you so much. Buenos días. Espero que están muy bien. Muchas gracias por invitarme a hablar con ustedes de Derecho Constitucional. El título de mi lectura es El futuro del Corte Suprema de los Estados Unidos, porque mi español es muy pobre y lento. Obviamente, voy a continuar en inglés. This talk will attempt to explore some of the ideas from my recent book, Rationing the Constitution, to make some predictions about the future directions of constitutional law in the US Supreme Court. Among close observers of the United States Supreme Court, law professors and legal commentators, politicians, there is a great sense of anticipation today. Conservatives eagerly anticipate a sweeping constitutional revolution, rolling back much of the US constitutional law established by more liberal Supreme Courts over the past 5 decades. Liberals view this possibility with something approaching terror, but both sides view dramatic change as more or less inevitable across a wide range of constitutional domains, spanning federalism, the division of power between the federal and the state governments, the administrative state, the power of the federal bureaucracy, religious freedom, abortion rights, gun rights, property rights, and much more. There is obviously something to this view. According to standard political science measures, the appointments of 2 new Supreme Court justices by President Donald Trump, Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh, have produced the most conservative United States Supreme Court in more than 80 years. It would be very surprising if the next decade did not produce many conservative decisions. It is very possible that this conservative shift will be quite significant, especially in particular areas. I'm thinking of the constitutional law of guns and religion and abortion, which are 3 of the most politically controversial areas in which the US Supreme Court makes decisions. But the judicial capacity model of Supreme Court decision-making that I developed in my recent book, Rationing the Constitution, suggests that both conservatives and liberals expect too much. A major revolution in US constitutional law, I believe, is unlikely in the near future. And the reason for that is straightforward, even if it is frequently overlooked. The Supreme Court of the United States is a tiny institution, capable of deciding only a small fraction of the constitutional questions generated by the operation of the United States government. In many of the most important constitutional domains, the limits of judicial capacity strongly constrain the court to defer to the political process, to cast its decisions in the form of clear categorical rules or both. To do otherwise, to depart from these approaches, to aggressively review legislation or executive branch decisions in ways that would promote a strong or robust conservative agenda, would invite more litigation than the Supreme Court can handle, more cases than the Supreme Court can handle. Since categorical rules are frequently clumsy and poorly matched to their underlying purposes, the limits of judicial capacity create strong pressure on the court to employ deferential doctrines like rational basis review that leave most important decisions to other institutional actors like Congress or the president or state governments. Now, this point should not be overstated. As I write in the book, the Supreme Court is capable of issuing occasional decisions that reshape major areas of public policy and which thwart the will of democratic majorities. This seems quite likely in some areas, in particular gun rights and some kinds of property rights, where the court is happy to let the lower federal courts have the final word in most cases. The Supreme Court, that is to say, doesn't feel much pressure to get involved in a large fraction of the cases in those areas. But former US Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia was wrong to worry about a Supreme Court standing at the apex, the pinnacle of government, empowered to decide all constitutional questions, always and everywhere primary in its role. And the same goes for today's prophets, those predicting a constitutional revolution, vindicating conservative constitutional principles today. So I want to begin my talk by briefly summarizing the judicial capacity model of Supreme Court decision-making developed in my book, with a special emphasis on a distinction between what I call normal domains, where judicial capacity, the fear of inviting too many cases, does not strongly constrain the Supreme Court, and what I will call capacity-constrained domains, where judicial capacity has a much more powerful constraining or limiting effect. I will then move on to the main focus of my remarks. What should we expect to see in the coming years from the US Supreme Court in capacity-constrained domains where the new conservative majority of justices is highly motivated to expand the scope of judicial review, to make judicial review more aggressive, to assert the court's power. I will sketch 6 possible futures, which are consistent with the predictions of my judicial capacity model, which largely predicts a modest role for the court, depicts the court as a relatively powerless institution compared to the other major institutions of US government. I will then conclude by sketching 2 alternative scenarios that would, to varying degrees, represent falsifications or contradictions of my model. Before I continue, I want to define 3 terms that I will be using throughout my talk here this afternoon. A rule, or a categorical rule, as I will sometimes say, is a legal norm whose application prospective litigants and lower court judges can readily predict in advance. Think of a speed limit of 90 kilometers per hour. A standard, or a vague standard, as I will sometimes say, is the opposite of a rule. Standards allow for more nuance than rules, more consideration of case-specific factors, but also generate greater uncertainty, increasing the volume of litigation and the frequency of conflict among lower court decisions, and thus the workload of the United States Supreme Court. Outside of constitutional law, think of a speed limit, prohibiting cars from driving unreasonably fast. That is a norm which obviously requires more case-by-case application and whose application is more difficult to predict than a simple speed limit of 90 kilometers per hour. In capacity-constrained constitutional domains, the Supreme Court faces strong pressure to employ categorical rules rather than vague standards, to limit the volume, the number of lower court decisions that it will feel compelled to review. The final term I need to define is defer, or in its other forms, deference and deferential. A deferential decision is one that treats government decisions challenged as unconstitutional as presumptively correct. A rule of categorical deference is one under which the government always or almost always wins, and plaintiffs challenging government action as unconstitutional almost always lose. In other words, it is a rule which limits the power of the Supreme Court to strike down or invalidate the actions of other government actors. In capacity-constrained domains, the Supreme Court faces strong pressure to defer to other government actors, often in the form of categorical rules of deference. It is this judicial capacity pressure that makes a sweeping conservative constitutional revolution unlikely. The conservative justices can certainly roll back liberal constitutional rights, such as the right to abortion, which is very likely in the near future. And they can establish new constitutional rights that mostly threaten state and local laws, such as gun rights, because the justices do not feel themselves a strong compulsion to get involved in so many of those cases, because they only involve state and local laws. But judicial capacity severely limits the Supreme Court's ability to impose major new constitutional restrictions on the federal government. To do so would invite more litigation than the Supreme Court could handle. With that, I'll begin by briefly describing my judicial capacity model of Supreme Court decision-making. That model can be reduced to three simple central propositions. The first of those propositions is that the Supreme Court can decide only 150 to 200 cases per year. This is widely recognized, long established, and not original to me. The second proposition is that the Supreme Court's limited capacity is a function, a product, not just of limited resources and personnel, there are only 9 justices, but crucially of widely shared judicial norms. In particular, the court's long-standing commitments to holding elaborate oral arguments and issuing substantial written opinions, and the justices' aversion, their resistance to delegating substantial decision-making authority to lower-level administrative staff, to maintaining significant involvement in every decision that the court makes themselves. If the court were to relax either of these commitments, as I understand the Supreme Court of Brazil frequently does, it could decide far more cases. But this seems unlikely, at least in the near term. Of special importance is the Supreme Court's long-standing commitment to maintaining uniformity, consistency in the application and enforcement of federal law, which leads the court to grant review virtually every time a lower court invalidates a federal statute. Third, this means that the Supreme Court has to be very careful how many such lower court decisions it invites with its own rulings, how many lower court decisions invalidating federal laws that it invites with its own rulings. In constitutional domains involving a large number of federal statutes, the limits of judicial capacity create an almost irresistible pressure on the Supreme Court to make one of 2 choices, and frequently both. First, the court can cast its decisions in the form of clear but clumsy categorical rules. For example, Congress can always regulate economic activity, but it can never regulate economic inactivity. Such rules are clumsy, and they often make little functional sense. They do little to advance the underlying purpose of constitutional law, in this case, to create a sensible division of power between the federal government and the states. But They make it easy for litigants and lower courts to predict the outcome. This in turn increases the chances of settlement outside of court. Second, the court can defer to the constitutional decisions of other government actors. Such deference reduces the expected value or benefit of bringing suit by increasing the odds that the government defendant will prevail. If plaintiffs thinking about challenging government action as unconstitutional know in advance that the government will always or nearly always win, there is little incentive, little reason to bring suit in the first place. Often, the constraints of judicial capacity compel the Supreme Court to adopt both of these strategies, because any other approach would invite more litigation, more new cases than the court could handle without sacrificing its basic commitments to minimum professional standards and the uniformity of federal law. I call these domains, the ones implicating a large number of federal statutes, capacity-constrained domains. All other domains, that is, domains where capacity does not strongly constrain the Supreme Court's decisions, I refer to as normal domains. In normal domains, the court reviews such a tiny fraction of cases, is so content to leave most decisions to the lower courts, to let the lower courts have the final word on most decisions, that the volume of litigation invited by its decisions imposes no strong constraint on the development of constitutional doctrine. Even if the court's decisions in these areas invite a flood of new cases, as they frequently do, nearly all of the burden will fall on the lower courts, whose capacity is far more flexible and of less direct and personal concern to the justices of the Supreme Court. Examples of capacity-constrained domains include federalism, in particular the commerce and spending powers granted to Congress by the US Constitution, the president's Article 2 powers over the federal bureaucracy, the president's powers to direct the federal administrative state, equal protection of the laws established by the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution, and regulatory takings or expropriations of private property. Examples of normal domains where the Supreme Court is not strongly constrained by judicial capacity include the Second Amendment, right to keep and bear arms, the right to own a firearm and to keep one for self-defense, abortion rights, and religion clauses protecting religious freedom and prohibiting the state from establishing a government endorsed religion. In normal domains, the limits of judicial capacity impose few, if any, constraints on the ambitions of the new conservative majority of justices. I thus have little comfort to offer liberals or caution to offer conservatives about the future of constitutional law in these areas. I think there's a good chance that the new conservative majority on the Supreme Court will push constitutional law in a significantly more conservative direction in normal domains, in particular in the highly controversial and highly salient domains of abortion rights and gun rights, as well as rights to religious freedom, which have often come up in the context of public health measures to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, which impinge on or interfere with religious observance. About capacity-constrained domains, however, the judicial capacity model does make a clear prediction. The Supreme Court in these domains will be strongly constrained to employ some combination of hard-edged categorical rules. Think again of the distinction between economic activity, which the federal government is permitted to regulate, and economic activity, which it is strictly forbidden to regulate, and strong deference to the political process, rules that basically announce in advance to plaintiffs and government defendants alike that when a plaintiff brings suit, the government will almost always win. This sounds, I hope, fairly straightforward, but as I shall explain presently, it could play out in a number of different ways in practice. The judicial capacity model does not entirely eliminate the possibility of a conservative constitutional revolution, but it does make that prospect much less likely. That, of course, raises the question, what are we likely to see instead? In the remainder of my talk, I will sketch several possible scenarios. If the judicial capacity model is correct, the future of US constitutional law is likely to follow one or more of these paths, at least in capacity-constrained domains, roughly, again, those domains which implicate or affect the constitutionality of a large number of federal statutes. This includes most federalism questions, questions of presidential power, and many of the most important individual rights questions under the due process and equal protection clauses of the United States Constitution. The first scenario I'm going to call the sober second thought. Libertarian and conservative opponents of federal power, as opposed to state power, of the federal bureaucracy, as opposed to legislative power, and modern social and economic regulation have been predicting a conservative constitutional revolution for a long time. They've certainly been calling for such a revolution for a long time, 30 or more years. As Harvard Law professor Adrian Vermeule points out, this eschatological hope, this hope for the dawning of a decisively distinct or different constitutional era, is not some recent development. It is the ordinary state of conservative jurisprudence, the perpetual, soon but not yet, of the conservative constitutional imagination. But faced with the potential disruption and the kind of avalanche or flood of litigation that a constitutional revolution embracing conservative principles would invite, I think it's decidedly possible that one or more of the conservative justices might well have occasion for more sober second thoughts. Basically, that the justices will get cold feet. Prime candidates include Justice Brett Kavanaugh, with his strong pragmatic streak, Justice John Roberts, with his sense of institutional responsibility as Chief Justice, and Justice Samuel Alito, with his fondness for law enforcement, Homeland Security, and immigration authority, all of which could be threatened in various ways by the new constitutional limits advocated by many constitutional conservatives. That brings us to scenario 2, which I will call speak loudly and carry a small stick, playing on US President Teddy Roosevelt's famous injunction to speak to speak softly and carry a big stick. Rather than backing down completely, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court might impose modest limits on Congress's power that invalidate one or two laws while clearly insulating the vast majority of federal legislation from constitutional doubt. For example, in two recent cases, NFIB versus Sebelius, which involved a constitutional challenge to the major healthcare reform legislation spearheaded by President Barack Obama, and Free Enterprise Fund versus PCAOB, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court loudly proclaimed new constitutional limits on federal power and on executive power, presidential power, that each threatened only one federal statute. In this way, the conservative majority managed to take bold rhetorical stands in favor of federalism and presidential control over the administrative bureaucracy, while at the same time making clear that the vast majority of federal legislation was completely safe against serious constitutional challenge. Scenario 3, I will call the US Courts of Appeals would prefer not to. After decades of pent-up frustration, the conservative majority of the Supreme Court may well be tempted to go farther imposing a number of broad constitutional limits on federal power, the federal bureaucracy, and modern economic regulation more generally. If this turns out to be the case, the reaction of the lower federal courts, the lower levels of the US judicial system, will be crucial in determining the meaning of those limits in practice. If those lower courts prefer not to put real teeth in the newly announced limits, there is a real chance that those limits, however aggressive they might seem, however strict they might seem in practice, or in principle, in theory, in the decisions of the US Supreme Court, will turn into rules of categorical deference in practice. This is exactly what has happened on the few occasions in the past when the Supreme Court has previously attempted to impose serious constitutional limits in other capacity-constrained domains. The Supreme Court, of course, could have stepped in and reversed these deferential lower court decisions until the lower courts fell in line, but it chose not to. This pattern prompted legal scholars Glenn Reynolds and Brennan Denning to pose the question: what if the Supreme Court held a constitutional revolution and nobody came? The obvious answer is that there would be no constitutional revolution in reality without much more work by the Supreme Court. It is easy to imagine events playing out in just this way if the Supreme Court sets out to impose broad constitutional limits cast in the form of a vague standard as opposed to a clear categorical rule. For example, if the court held that Congress can regulate, can pass laws only to address truly serious national problems, the definition of a vague standard, the lower courts might simply defer to Congress's judgment on this question, on the question of what constitutes a truly serious national problem in most or all cases. In that case, the law on the books would remain a vague and stringent standard. The lower courts don't have the power to overrule Supreme Court precedent, but the law in action would be a rule of categorical deference. Scenario 4 is something like the opposite of scenario 3. Call it advance and retreat. Today's lower federal courts are staffed by 4 years of judges nominated by President Donald Trump, most of them handpicked for their ideological dependability, which is to say their strong conservative principles. Many of these judges are clearly eager to do battle against what they perceive as excesses of federal power, excesses of the federal administrative bureaucracy, and modern economic regulations. If this is the case, and if the Supreme Court embraces a similar approach, the lower courts can be counted on to hand down many decisions that the Supreme Court will feel compelled to review, many decisions invalidating federal laws or federal executive actions that the lower courts will feel compelled to review. At this point, the Supreme Court will have two choices: to hold firm, to maintain its decisions and to defend those decisions at the risk of overwhelming its limited capacity, or to retreat from those decisions to safer ground, to more deferential approaches that will invite less litigation. Faced with such stark alternatives, it would not be at all surprising to see one or more of the conservative justices switch sides and back down. Scenario 5, I call cannons, not heavy constitutional artillery. That is, cannons with one N, as in canons or guiding principles of statutory construction. In a much discussed 2000 article, Harvard Law professor Cass Sunstein argued that the Supreme Court has not, in fact, abandoned constitutional limits on the federal bureaucracy, as is commonly supposed. Rather, those limits have merely been renamed and relocated. According to Sunstein, their current home consists of a set of interpretive canons, principles that guide statutory interpretation, which forbid executive agencies from making certain decisions on their own. To oversimplify slightly, these canons or principles of interpretations require courts to construe or interpret statutes narrowly to limit federal power whenever broader readings of those statutes would threaten important values such as federalism or separation of powers. In addition to, or instead of the approaches that I have just sketched, a conservative Supreme Court motivated to revive conservative constitutional limits without exceeding its capacity limits might increase the number and the robustness, the strength of these interpretive canons. This approach might well generate additional litigation, but it would not result in the invalidation of federal legislation because these canons of interpretation merely require the narrow interpretation of federal statutes, not their constitutional invalidation. The Supreme Court, therefore, would not feel compelled to review such a high fraction of the resulting cases. Finally, we come to scenario 6, which I will call the full hamburger, in homage to US legal scholar Philip Hamburger, who is perhaps the most enthusiastic academic supporter of robust constitutional limits on the federal bureaucracy or administrative state. Rather than embrace vague standards that require lower courts to determine how much federal power or bureaucratic power or economic regulation is too much, the Supreme Court might adopt the sort of categorical, bright line rule advocated by scholars like Hamburger, which would flatly prohibit or forbid congressional delegations of power to the federal bureaucracy, full stop. Such a prohibition on agency rulemaking power would invalidate a far greater number of legislative delegations than a vaguer or middle ground approach that would permit some delegation of power, but not too much. But Hamburger's sweeping prohibition on all delegation of rulemaking power would achieve this result with much greater clarity and precision. It would be clear to both plaintiffs and the government in advance that any delegation of rulemaking power to federal agencies was unconstitutional. As such, this approach might actually invite less litigation than versions of this same constitutional limitation that take the form of vaguer standards. And it would be much easier for the Supreme Court to consolidate similar cases for joint disposition, to deal with similar cases all at once in one fell swoop. Going the full hamburger would still generate a lot of litigation, quite possibly more than the Supreme Court could handle. There are simply so many thousands of delegations of power to federal executive branch agencies that the Supreme Court would be kept very busy, even if it announced this kind of clear categorical prohibition. That might produce more litigation than the Supreme Court could handle without sacrificing minimum professional standards and its commitment to the uniformity of federal law. But this is an open question. A highly motivated Supreme Court might be able to revive a sweeping conservative constitutional vision without exceeding the court's limited capacity if it is willing to embrace this sort of broad categorical rule. The full hamburger, scenario 6, is thus the one scenario consistent with the predictions of the judicial capacity model that is also consistent with prophecies of conservative constitutional revolution. But there is good reason to doubt that the Supreme Court would be willing to go this far. The sort of sweeping constitutional limits that Philip Hamburger advocates would be almost indescribably disruptive to the ordinary operations of the federal government. It would also threaten many forms of bureaucratic authority that the court's conservatives have strong ideological reasons to support, such as law enforcement and immigration enforcement. I therefore consider this the least likely of the 6 scenarios that I have sketched thus far. Before I close, I want to briefly discuss two additional scenarios that are, to differing degrees, inconsistent with the judicial capacity model that I elaborate in my book, and which I've described for you here this morning in Tucson, Arizona, where I am, this afternoon, where you are. If either of these scenarios comes to pass, it will be necessary to reevaluate and perhaps abandon the model. I cannot deny this would wound my personal pride to some degree, but it would also teach us something quite interesting about the United States Supreme Court as an institution. Scenario 7 we can call the Faustian bargain, after the legendary Dr. Faustus, who sells his soul for worldly knowledge and pleasure. As I emphasized at the outset, the limits of judicial capacity do not spring from resource constraints alone. They are also, crucially, the result of long-standing and widely shared norms of Supreme Court practice, most notably the court's commitment to maintaining certain minimum professional standards in terms of written opinions and holding oral argument in every case, and its commitment to reviewing virtually every lower court decision that invalidates a federal law. If a majority of the court is willing to sacrifice these commitments, if it is willing to delegate significant decision-making authority to lower-level staffers, if it is willing to forego the lengthy written opinions that it currently issues in every case, if it is willing to leave decisions of lower courts invalidating federal laws unreviewed, then the constraints of judicial capacity will impose no obstacle, or far less of an obstacle, to a sweeping conservative constitutional revolution. Most straightforwardly, such a court might simply deny review, refuse to hear a large number of lower court cases invalidating federal laws. Alternatively, the justices might grant review and decide large numbers of these cases without oral argument or substantial written opinions. Neither of these possibilities strikes me as particularly likely, but both are clearly possible if a majority of the court is sufficiently motivated to dismantle federal power, the federal administrative state, or modern social and economic regulation more generally, or to undertake any other sweeping constitutional reform effort that would otherwise overwhelm the court's limited capacity. In one sense, this scenario would represent a confirmation, not a falsification of the judicial capacity model. After all, the model emphasizes the central role of norms in constituting, in creating the limits of judicial capacity. It also acknowledges the contingency of the specific norms that have starkly limited the Supreme Court's capacity for at least the past 85 years. These norms evolved in one way, but they could have evolved in other ways. And in other countries, they clearly have evolved in other ways. Nevertheless, the dissolution of these norms would deprive the judicial capacity model of most of its explanatory and its predictive power, and thus of most of its significant utility going forward. Scenario 8, the final scenario I'm going to discuss this morning, we can call Chicken Little, after the children's story in which the main character mistakenly believes that the sky is falling. What if the Supreme Court embraces strong constitutional limits in a sustained way with the active cooperation of the lower courts and the sky does not fall? That is, what if no flood of cases materializes? This possibility, which obviously cannot be ruled out a priori, would represent an even more direct challenge to the judicial capacity model. It would also raise a number of interesting questions. Why did no flood of cases materialize? Were there too few plaintiffs with too few resources? Or what amounts to the same thing, too little organization? to mount a sustained challenge? Was the judicial capacity model wrong to assume, following a large body of existing literature, that stringent constitutional doctrines invite more litigation than deferential ones? That standards, vague standards, invite more litigation than rules? Did a sympathetic conservative administration acquiesce in unfavorable lower court decisions, simply refuse to appeal those decisions, or settle widespread legal challenges en masse as a group outside of court? Whatever the answers to these questions, are they particular to the present historical moment, or do they also undermine the judicial capacity model's retrospective, backward-looking, predictive power? The list of questions could go on, but I think you will get the idea. The first 5 scenarios I've sketched here today strike me as more likely than the last 3. If this is right, if the future of the United States Supreme Court follows one of these 5 paths, or more than one of these 5 paths, there may well be a significant conservative shift in US constitutional law. That shift will affect millions of lives, sometimes in very profound ways, but it will not constitute a sweeping constitutional revolution. Indeed, in many of the most important constitutional domains, judicial capacity will keep the Supreme Court constrained within fairly narrow bounds. The fate and the future of the country will be determined elsewhere. I'm very happy to take your questions.
Thank you, Andrew. Before the questions, we are gonna listen, and Cecilia McLean, Professor Cecilia McLean is gonna make some comments and also some explanations about the lecture.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Andrew. That was very interesting to listen to, but I should probably make 2 points that that distinguish our system from the US system. And these 2 points are very crucial to what you mentioned, and to understand how different what you have said, or how foreign what you have mentioned is to us. First of all, we have a unitary system. So we never have to deal with, and this is the federal versus state competency is a foreign issue for us. So whenever we start to study US law, we have to learn to think about federal and state and think where should we go to, and the competencies, and where they are exclusive and where they share the competency. So this is the first point. The second point is about the judicial capacity. It's not that we don't suffer from it, is that we don't limit our capacity. So this is a strange concept for us, because probably we should limit. This is why our processes take years and years and years. And there are some statistics within the judiciary that they know how far behind they are. And unfortunately, and I hope it doesn't happen to the US, but unfortunately, our judges do delegate. Unfortunately, they delegate what they shouldn't. They share administrative and judicial responsibilities, and they end up delegating the judiciary, the jurisdictional capabilities, instead of delegating the administrative responsibilities. So for us, this is one thing that students have to realize when they listen, and of course everybody is very attentive, And I have a lot of students in US common law course that ask the question, especially now before President Trump came out of office, when he nominated Amy Coney Barrett to replace RBG, especially because they're so opposed. And the last three justices they repeat specifically that they follow Justice Scalia's thoughts in everything. No, they are originalists and they follow. It's like they are not their own people, but they follow somebody else that was very vocal in the Supreme Court. So this is very interesting for us because we don't have these issues. And of course, we see how this changes. But there's a third thing that we don't have, is we don't have judicial review, not the way you have it. And in that sense, our judicial power is not a strong power. So this is something that is not so strong. So we wish we had a stronger and more, I don't know if liberal or conservative, that should be for people to decide, but we don't, our judicial powers don't decide at all. They are shy to deciding, and they would rather say, we don't have the competency to decide or even interpret what the Constitution should say. So this is something that is very different. And so in light of this, thinking of what you said about the categorical rules and the standards, we live by categorical rules, unfortunately. So and I think a lot of the questions from the students will come to what are the dangers of going to all these scenarios, not only because of the of how it brings a flow of contradictions between the decisions, but also the increase in bureaucracy within the judicial system, but also how it will come down to the people and how it will legitimize the judicial power, because now we feel that for better or for worse, I mean, even if you don't like the decisions, you respect the decisions. No, and there has been up to now, at least, a good amount of institutionalized and I think respect for institutions in the US. And I think your last president has done a great deal to go against this institutional respect in the US. But one of the things that maybe poses a question for me is, even if these conservative judges want to make all the decisions that all the possibilities that you mentioned, how would they go against stare decisis if it doesn't present itself? Because there are some rules to change stare decisis. Even if you're a conservative, you have to pose the decision that it goes against the times, or there are some constraints to change the president. So how, I suppose that would be my first question. How would they go against it, or how would they go over stare decisis?
Thank you. Those are wonderful comments. And I think the contrast you've drawn between the two systems are extremely helpful. in thinking about the core trade-off that courts, I think, all around the world are required to make, and also for demonstrating that there are lots of different ways in which courts can make that trade-off. Courts, hierarchically organized court systems, have limited resources, and they have to make some fundamental choices about how many cases they can process. And the choices that the United States Supreme Court has made fall, I think, at one far end of a spectrum. The court has prioritized direct personal involvement by the justices of the US Supreme Court in every case. It's prioritized things like elaborate oral arguments and elaborate written decisions, and it's refused to delegate decisions to lower level staffers, and that has radically reduced the number of cases that it can decide. That means that even though we, in theory, have a very strong system of judicial review in the United States, the Supreme Court routinely asserts, and most people accept, that the Supreme Court justices have the final word. They are the supreme expositors of the US Constitution, in the words of the famous decision, Cooper versus Aaron. In fact, in actual operation, the court is much weaker than I think a lot of people assume, because of the limits that judicial capacity imposes on its ability to significantly challenge other institutional actors.
Can I ask you a small question related to that?
Yes.
I gathered that they only review like 1% of the cases that come to their attention.
It's a little bit higher than 1%, but it's a very tiny percentage of cases. And there's no requirement, no formal requirement that they hear any of those cases. Their power to review lower court decisions is almost entirely discretionary. There's a very tiny category of cases in which the Supreme Court is compelled to hear appeals from the lower court, but it's very small, and it does not apply. The vast majority of the cases the court is asked to hear fall outside of that category. Nevertheless, the court is, and historically has been, very strongly committed to reviewing any decision by the lower courts that invalidates a federal law. That is, I think, taken for granted by all the justices across the political spectrum, that hearing a case in which a lower court strikes down a federal law as unconstitutional is a strong obligation for the US Supreme Court. And it's that norm, that commitment, which I think really constrains what the court can do in the way of placing serious constitutional limits on the federal government. Because the more constitutional limits it places on the federal government, the more plaintiffs who are going to come to court to challenge federal action, and the more cases the US Supreme Court will have to hear. Now, let me turn to the very good question that you raised about stare decisis. If the conservative justices want to make major changes, either in the capacity constrained domains that I've been talking about, or in some of the other domains like abortion and gun rights, which are not capacity constrained, they will have to deal with past decisions going the other way, past decisions that they don't like and want to overturn in order to effectuate their conservative vision of constitutional law. And you are, of course, right that the US system, like common law systems around the world, is governed, at least formally speaking, by a principle of stare decisis, which is a Latin phrase that means let the decision stand, and requires courts at least to provide reasons before departing from a previous precedent. It is not an ironclad rule that requires courts always and everywhere to follow previous decisions. It is well recognized across the political spectrum of judicial philosophies in the United States that stare decisis has exceptions. It's a flexible standard rather than a categorical rule requiring courts to always adhere to prior decisions. And one of the things that has become apparent over the last 5 years or so in the United States is that the recognized exceptions to stare decisis are sufficiently flexible that a motivated group of justices, motivated majority of the Supreme Court, can almost always make a plausible case that some previous decision is sufficiently wrong or has been sufficiently eroded or undermined by subsequent legal developments that there is room within the limits of stare decisis to reverse that decision. There are a small number of originalist justices who claim to follow in the footsteps of Justice Antonin Scalia, who have a different view, who more or less reject the principle of stare decisis as it applies to constitutional cases on the theory that the previous decisions of the US Supreme Court are not the supreme law of the land, it's the Constitution that is the supreme law of the land. And if the Supreme Court previously got the Constitution wrong, then it's the Constitution and not the prior decisions of the court that should control. But these justices still are in the minority. There are at most 3 and probably just 2 justices who adhere to something like that view on the court. The other conservative justices, even the ones who profess to be originalists and to be bound in their decisions by the original historical meaning of the US Constitution, still accept the principle of stare decisis, but they have found ways to maneuver around it in almost every case where it stands as a significant obstacle to achieving their ideological objectives.
Can you ever imagine a revolution such that they overturn Marbury versus Madison?
Well, it would be against their personal interest to overturn Marbury versus Madison because, of course, it's the power of judicial review that gives the conservative majority of the Supreme Court the power. I think it's a starkly limited power for many of the reasons I've mentioned already today, but it's Marbury versus Madison that gives the court the power to implement, at least to some extent, a conservative vision of the Constitution.
Yeah. But Scalia was against it, though. I mean, so if they truly follow him, and he advocated reversing it. So, so that's why I made the question. But yeah. It's a self-defeating purpose. It would.
The court is confronting something like this issue right now in a pending abortion case that the court has just heard arguments on. The state of Texas passed quite recently an unusual law, which prohibits abortion, but instead of empowering the government to enforce that law, they've empowered private plaintiffs to bring private lawsuits against anyone who obtains an abortion or helps to obtain an abortion, including the abortion providers, the doctors who perform the abortions. And this was clearly an attempt to get around the court's power to review the constitutionality of the law. And the Supreme Court right now is going to decide whether it has the power to review a law like this one. And it's very interesting because the conservative outcome in this case, to let the law stand, to let the abortions basically come to a halt in the state of Texas, is one that would also undermine the power of the US Supreme Court to say what the law means. And the conservative justices are very invested in the power of the Supreme Court to say what the law means, because it's that power which is going to give them the power to put a real stamp on American government over the next 10 to 20 years. And so there's an interesting tension in that case.
Yes, and I think some of the students will be interested in that because we follow the news. So we've heard about this case, and actually I was surprised to, well, I don't know if I should be surprised, but I was surprised to see President Biden try to interfere in this situation. No, but I will give the floor to the students. I don't know, Kelly, if you want. I think there is one
question in the chat. Maybe I could read it.
Yes.
Okay, the question is, how it's possible to the Supreme Court to deal with the stare decisis principle and overruling fundamental rights as the right to abortion, even though that the right has been recognized by the Supreme Court in previous decisions? What maneuvers do they have to make for that purpose?
This is a variation on the question I think that was posed earlier. And I think some of the conservative justices will take the view and may well write an opinion which says simply that the right to an abortion established in earlier cases like Roe versus Wade has no foundation in the original meaning of the Constitution. Nowhere in the constitutional text of the United States can you find a fundamental right to obtain an abortion, nor was that text understood, the vague language in that text, like the right to due process, understood to protect a right to obtain an abortion at the time it was adopted, and that the Constitution, and not the previous decisions of the US Supreme Court, is the supreme law of the land. And that will be their justification. Justice Thomas and Justice Gorsuch take something like this view, I think. The other justices whose votes will be required to reverse Roe versus Wade and the right to abortion it established, I think take a more modest view and are likely to write an opinion, if they end up reversing that decision, that says something like, we believe that the legal foundations of Roe versus Wade have been eroded over time, have collapsed over time. The court's subsequent decisions in cases like Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which is the 1992 decision that upheld some of Roe versus Wade, but also limited it in certain ways. The current justice will say represented or illustrates that the decision as it was originally decided in 1973 was not workable. And they will say that subsequent decisions by the US Supreme Court that recognize a state government's strong interest in protecting fundamental life have further undermined the foundations of Roe versus Wade. And finally, they will say that the line that Roe versus Wade and subsequent precedents drew separating the period of pregnancy when a woman has a right, a constitutional right to terminate her pregnancy, from the later stages of pregnancy where that right does not exist. This is the line of viability. The right to obtain an abortion under current law applies up and until the fetus that a woman is carrying becomes viable, is capable of living outside of the woman's body. They will say that line is not workable because science is changing it all the time. As neonatal care has advanced, the line separating viability from non-viability has moved earlier into the pregnancy. And as a result, the rule established by our prior decisions is not workable in practice and needs to be abandoned. On top of that, they will say that the rule was wrong in the first place, and very wrong, I think, in the view of some of these justices in the first place, and that when a decision is recognized to have been wrong in the first place and egregiously wrong, that is a long recognized exception to the doctrine of stare decisis.
Andrew, if I could ask you, when did this concept of capacity start restraining the Supreme Court? Because I suppose that they didn't start constraining because there weren't so many cases, but more or less, when did they start making this decision of, I will prioritize the quality of my work rather than attend all of them? Is that in your book as well?
I think that capacity has constrained the US Supreme Court in the way that I've described, at least since the early 1930s. way in which the Supreme Court operates radically changed in 1925 with the passage of the Judiciary Act of 1925, which gave the Supreme Court much greater control over its own docket, over the cases it hears. Prior to 1925, most of the Supreme Court's jurisdiction was mandatory. It had to hear almost any case coming before it, and its practices were very different. Shortly after, so there are two key developments. One is the passage of the Judiciary Act of 1925, which gave the court discretion over the cases it hears. And the second is the major expansion of federal power that occurred during the New Deal, which was the sort of umbrella term used to describe all of the ambitious legislative reforms pushed by Franklin Roosevelt to address the Great Depression. Prior to the New Deal, the federal government of the United States was relatively small compared to the state governments. There was relatively little federal regulation, relatively little in the way of federal administrative bureaucracy, and therefore fewer federal laws that were subject to constitutional challenge. That changed radically during the New Deal and the decades that followed, when the federal government ballooned in size, dramatically increased in size. And the combination of the discretionary jurisdiction conferred by the Judiciary Act of 1925 and the changes that it effected in Supreme Court practice with the radical expansion of the federal government during the New Deal, I think gave rise to the modern practice of the Supreme Court and the ways in which judicial capacity constrains the modern court. Okay,
so I wanted to go back to how our judicial system is organized. If we were to make a comparison, it's like if we were a state. No, so we have the small claims court, then we have the district court, then we have the superior court, that is the Court of Appeals, and then we have the Supreme Court. They all follow ordinary procedures. But then we have what we call a constitutional tribunal, which is separate from the judicial power. It's independent and it's autonomous. And they are both autonomous and they follow the Constitution as well, but they don't relate with each other. And however, the Constitutional Tribunal is elected by Congress, and they decide all the elements that are related to fundamental rights. And they have way too many cases now. They receive all the cases, but they end up not finishing the cases in the year. And there is a movement now to try to send some of the cases that could be, because of capacity, they should be sent to the ordinary courts that should view, and then the more important cases should stay in this constitutional tribunal. However, there is still some question of whether the ordinary courts have still the capacity, because they are starting to prioritize, but they're working their way on being efficient and trying to establish a way in which they want to prioritize quality of the work and not so much the administrative part. So there is some change towards looking at the US legal system to see how it works and the concept of precedent, not in the same way, but looking at some of the elements. What we don't have, and this is something that not all of the students know, is this two-way street towards the US Supreme Court. That is the federal system, that is the district court, the Court of Appeals, and Supreme Court, and then this review by way of writ of certiorari to the Supreme Court if you go through the state courts. you know? So this two-way street toward the Supreme Court, for us, we have two institutions that make the same, that have this role. And we still have a problem of capacity, but we deal in a different way. That's why I asked you, because like you said, it's a question of prioritizing. I think it's never a question of what is best, because I think people in the later years are starting to go towards legal action more than ever. I don't know if it's too much, but they're going more than ever.
This is very interesting for me to hear, and it sounds like your constitutional court has, in a different form, many of the same problems that the US Supreme Court faces. The US Supreme Court is asked to hear many thousands of cases a year, but the justices, of course, cannot hear that many cases. And they're also not interested in hearing that many cases. They want to focus on what they perceive as the most important cases, the cases that will give them an opportunity to make broad statements of law that will help to clarify complicated questions that are affecting the whole country, and not to spend their time dealing with the more minor cases, in particular cases that affect just the interests of one or a few individuals. And the discretion given to them by the Judiciary Act of 1925 enables them to prioritize in that way. But I think that's been very much one of the historical challenges for the US Supreme Court. It's a challenge that led the justices of the court to actively lobby Congress in the early 1920s to give them more discretion over their caseload, because when they were required to hear every case that came to them, as they were mostly prior to 1925, they were facing a problem or a situation that sounds quite similar to the one that your court is facing today.
I think always very clear for all the students, because we don't have more questions. I think that the comparison that made Ana Cecilia and the questions and replies that they both have was very clear, was very useful for the students. So I think that we have to say thank you to Andrew, because this lecture was very useful, especially for our Arizona students, and also for the students that have the course of common law with Ana Cecilia and with other professors. And this is a very fantastic way to close our law week, because we are in the law week of the university. So thanks again, Andrew, for being with us. And also thank you, Ana Cecilia, for accept and make the comments for the lecture of Andrew.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, Ana Cecilia, for the wonderful comments and discussion. It was really a pleasure.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure for me too. Thank you. Thank you, Kelly. Okay.
Thank you for organizing, Kelly.
Gracias, Andrew. Muchas gracias a todos los alumnos de la facultad que se han conectado. Nuevamente gracias al decano de Arizona y a la profesora Ana Cecilia Maglin por haber estado con nosotros. Thanks and see you soon.
Okay.